Hey everyone, happy Friday! And that can only mean one thing, well, usually anyway. It means that Ask Shane Anything is live for our patrons. Now, this show happens because some of y'all pledge at $7 or more per month at that Ask Shane tier, but everybody gets to watch the archive. Everybody gets to ask questions. However, I do prioritize questions from those of you who are pledging at that higher tier. Once again, you guys have asked more great questions that I can slide into one episode. Let's get going. Our first question this week comes from Mountain Lifter. My understanding is that PS4 Pro and Xbox One X were needed mid-console cycle to try to deliver on the 4K promise because the non-Pro versions were still stuck at 1080p. Were there other reasons for the Pro versions to exist back then? And now, what is the reason Sony is creating the PS5 Pro? Based on the information out so far, does it make sense to you? Or is this a cash grab? Is there even a real need for this to exist? Okay, Mountain Lifter, I think what you've hit on here, well, I think you've hit on something that maybe you may not have even recognized on your own. What we're seeing right now is a divergence of the paths for Xbox and PlayStation. Xbox, I think at this point, just wants this generation to be over as quickly as possible. Game Pass hasn't caught on as well as it would have hoped, but more than that, the Xbox Series X has just languished. It has not sold well. People are not buying it, and in fact, the sales are continuing to kind of go down. So I think you have two different perspectives here. You have PlayStation that's dominating this generation and conceivably wants this generation to go on forever. Then you have Xbox who's like, you know what, let's just turn the page on Xbox Series X. And my guess is, too, we're probably not going to see two different consoles next generation from Xbox. We'll see. My guess is that's going to be the case. So I think what you're seeing right now is a divergence of priorities due to how each one of them are doing in the market. So we're not going to get a mid-cycle Xbox Series X upgrade. We're only getting a PS5 Pro. Now, back to last generation. Absolutely. The Xbox One needed a mid-cycle refresh. And I think the biggest issue there was that third-party developers were struggling to make games look good on the base Xbox One. Now, Gears 5, it's a miracle. I don't know how they got that game to run on the base Xbox One, but they did. But that was the exception to the rule. I mean, generally, third parties were struggling to create games that looked on par with the base PS4. And so, sure, Xbox One X absolutely needed. Now, PS4 Pro, I think, was more in line with kind of what you're talking about. It was PlayStation trying to fulfill a promise about the PlayStation 4 that the base hardware was not going to be able to accomplish. So it's not like PlayStation was over the moon about 4K when it announced the base PS4. It mentioned that it might be possible to run some games in 4K. It wasn't a selling point per se of the PS4. Now the PS4 Pro, that's exactly what it was. And remember, PS4 Pro didn't really have native 4K. It used this kind of weird checkerboarding technique that can be used to basically fake 4K. But I'll fully admit, it's effective. Like, there was a huge difference in playing the checkerboard 4K stuff on PS4 Pro versus playing regular PS4 base PS4 games. So it worked. Now, your question here is like, does that make sense for the PlayStation 5? And I hear you. It really doesn't. The one thing I would say is in the build-up to the launch of the PS5, 4K ray tracing and all that kind of stuff was heavily promoted by Sony to be a part of PlayStation 5. Now, that hasn't really come to fruition. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but not many games still have ray tracing, and the ones that do, if you turn it on, the frame rate pretty much tanks. So, to be fair, the base PS5 has not lived up to PlayStation's initial marketing of the hardware. So, just again, rewind back to last gen with the Xbox and the Xbox One, where it was obvious Microsoft wasn't going to be able to deliver on promises. Now I think that's what we're getting with the PlayStation 5 Pro. I think it's Sony's way of saying, hey, well, we didn't quite get where we said we were going to go, but if you buy this new console, then sure. Now, you ask if it's a cash grab. No, because it's, now look, some people will buy a second PS5. I will, because I'll need it for work. So I will buy the PS5 Pro, and then I'll do whatever with my base PS5. Most people will not. Most people are going to be happy just having that base PS5 and just buying more games for that base PS5. If they don't run at 4K 60, for most people, that's not a deal breaker. So I think for the vast majority of people, they're not going to upgrade to the PS5 Pro, which means the cash grab angle of it, I just don't see that happening. I really just think that PlayStation is trying to put its foot on the throat of Xbox and just end it right there. And that's pretty much what'll happen. I mean, it's kind of over already, for being honest, as far as PS5 versus Xbox Series. I mean, that battle's done. But this will be PlayStation putting its foot on the neck of Xbox. And let's not forget, PlayStation still has like another 100 million PlayStation 5s to sell. That's so many consoles. So, to you, you may say, oh, well, I already have a PS5, now there's a better one, and there's a cash grab, they're trying to get me to spend more money. I mean, that's up to you, whether you want to do that or not. But the bottom line is that there are still so many more consoles to sell. This is still early, actually, for the PS5. Like, it still needs to sell another 100 million consoles for it to get into the same neighborhood as some of PlayStation's best-selling consoles ever. So I think what we're seeing here is just a divergence of the past, because each one has done, well, PlayStation's case, done great with PS5. Xbox case has not done great with Xbox Series X. I think it's more necessity than a cash grab or anything else like that. Next up, we have a question from Ask Shane Stalwart, Kevin. It seems like the era of demos is back. Why do you think developers are starting to release demos again? Is it simply to hope for better sales? Are the publishers forcing developers to create the demos? Why is there not a demo for every game? So Kevin, you may have picked up on something that I actually haven't picked up on, and it may be because we've covered a lot of demos in Game Face lately, and really the reason we're doing that is because there just aren't any games coming out. So these demos give us a chance to preview some of the big games that are coming out maybe a month later, a few weeks later, or whatever. It helps us a ton, honestly, the demos, as far as having content for you guys for every episode of Game Face. However, I don't know that there's actually an uptick in the number of demos that we can play. Now, I'll say this, if you look at today compared to when we first got hard drives in our consoles, then sure. Like, we are in the golden age of free demos right now. But if you just look back to, like, the beginning of the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series era, or even the PS4 and Xbox One era, we were getting a lot of demos back then, a lot of betas, a lot of things like that. So let me humor you, and I'll say, okay, there are maybe more demos now. Why is that? Well, I think you are going to, and if it isn't happening now, I think you're going to see publishers putting out a ton more demos going forward, because all their games are tanking. And look, publishers, they have hubris. They think that their games are better than other publishers. They should, or they shouldn't be doing it. And so they feel like if they put their games in your hands, you're going to pick their game over the other games. Will that happen? Well, if it happens for one, then it can't happen for the other. So I think there's some delusion going on there as well. But the bottom line is it's good, I think, for pretty much everybody. I think it's good for the publishers because they get feedback on their games before the game comes out. Now, to be fair with most demos, you're only going to have like a 2-week window there from when the demo feedback comes in to when the game launches. And while it may not affect the launch code all that much, it could ultimately affect patches on down the road. So the beta is positive for publishers in that way. Also, again, if they think their game is great, it's going to, give people a taste and make them remember it when it comes out a few weeks later. It's also good for consumers. It's great for us to be able to play these games before we decide to spend money on them. Now, I would argue sometimes the demos backfire. Like the recent demo for Sandland, like if you know what the actual full game is and then you play the demo, that demo does not do the game any justice. In fact, there's been a couple demos lately where I was like, might have been a better idea not to release these demos at all. But again, the publishers are getting desperate here because you have so few games soaking up so much of the money that the other guys are just kind of scrapping for these scraps, trying to get enough to just maybe turn a profit on their games. So I think that's why we're getting maybe more demos now, but I think it's great for everyone. I'm definitely not complaining about it. I guess the one thing I would say that has been a big change for me lately is Nintendo demos. We get a lot more demos for Nintendo games now than we used to. That, to me, is the one that's really changed the most. Look, third-party stuff, whatever. We get a good bit of that stuff on eShop. I'm talking about Nintendo first-party demos. Almost every game that comes out for Switch now, there's usually a demo that comes out like a month or two before the game comes out. We just did it with Princess Peach Showtime. It's pretty much every game from Nintendo, which is great. It gives us a chance to preview the game before we get the review code from Nintendo and deliver our review for you guys on Game Face. So I guess if I could see one element of the industry that has changed, as you said, I think it is Nintendo. I think Nintendo has, I wouldn't say lowered its standards, but I would say maybe loosen the reins on its first party content and become confident in it, even in its early pre-release stages, for people to play it and not reject it and then not buy the game. So that's been a big shift. But otherwise, I think, based on the PS4 era to now, I don't think things have changed all that much, but it's still way better than it used to be. Our last question for this week comes from Bachby. Why has Ken Levine been given more time than even Rockstar to create his next game, Judas? Is it because his development team is so small? Even now, it's only 44 people. Well, Bachby, I think you answered your own question. It's the cost of development. Now, I would argue that trying to build a game like Judas with 44 people is really frickin' stupid. And I don't know if that was Ken Levine's decision because he wanted to keep the team small, or whether that was the publisher's decision because they wanted to keep the cost down. But if it was the publisher's decision, I think they're seeing now that the drawback of that is like, okay, you pay less in salaries every year, but there's going to be more years. So I'll say this, though. Look, the budget for Judas isn't even in the same stratosphere as Grand Theft Auto 6. GTA 6 has at least 1,000 people working on it for at least 10 years. Pack always does the very simple math for this. Just average each employee gets 100K, then you multiply it by how many years, by how many employees, and that's generally the budget for the game's development. I would argue probably Judas is coming in, or maybe at like 80 million at this point, even with all the years. I mean, that's really not that much for a AAA game. Obviously, PlayStation first-party games are up over 200 and some million, 300 million, stuff like that. So maybe the publisher is looking at Judas and they're like, well, it's a pretty high-quality game. It could sell 10 to 20 million copies, and we're getting it at like 100 mil. Like, that's way cheaper than PlayStation, and PlayStation is a well-oiled machine. So the publisher could be looking at it like, this is actually a deal. Like, let's just keep giving Ken like 50 people to make games and let him spend a decade on it. He'll turn, he'll generate a couple $1 billion in revenue, and we'll make a ton of money off of it, and we'll just let him keep doing it. Like, selfishly, I hate that because I don't want to play Ken Levine's games once every 10 years. At that math, I'll get to play like 2 more before I die. To me, that's unacceptable. But I also understand from Ken's perspective, after going through the grinder of working on the BioShock franchise for so long and having to worry about announcing a date and then getting it delayed and then dealing with the backlash and then having to talk to people like me about it who are like holding you to task, I can see where you get tired of that. You're like, you know what? If I release a couple more games before I die, I'm cool. And as long as they're up to my quality, then I'm cool. And as long as the publisher's okay with me taking that long because I have a smaller team, then that's cool. I think Judas is a bit of a special case. And I'll be honest, I don't think many publishers would give a developer that type of leeway or bandwidth unless they were people like Ken Levine. So I think there's a lot of things going on here that are, coalescing into the development and ultimate release of Judas, not the least of which is a lot of respect that most people have for Ken Levine. I think in the end, people may herald him for creating a game like Judas if it turns out to be really good with such a small team, and he could change everything. What if other publishers suddenly are like, hey, why don't we follow that model? Let's find ourselves a figurehead who we know is going to turn out a great game. Give him enough time so he's not hating his life. Give him enough employees so that he's not having to do a lot of the hands-on stuff and rolling up his sleeves. And that might work. So we'll see how it all plays out. Judas could come out and it could be terrible. Like, we don't know. It is the spiritual successor to BioShock, but that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be good. Again, it has a small development team, as you pointed out. So Bachby, that's what I would say. You kind of answered your own question there. The truth of the matter is, even though it's taken this long, Judas's development budget is still pretty small, relatively speaking. Okay, that's it for Ask Shane Anything. I hope you guys are excited for the weekend. Hope you have some games lined up, or you're working on your backlog, which is far more likely. Maybe some of you guys are still playing Dragon's Dogma 2 or some of the bigger games that have come out, because there's nothing coming out in the early part of April. That will change here in a week or so, but right now it is pretty dry. So hope you guys have found something fun to play over the weekend. Thanks to all you guys who pledge at any tier, even the folks who are just giving us $1 a month just because. We appreciate all you guys, but a big thanks to people who are pledging at that $7 or more per month Ask Shane tier. Without them, this show just wouldn't happen. So thanks again, everybody. I appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you again for Ask Shane in a couple more weeks.